Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to another episode of Black Spy Podcast, the show that sheds a light on the area of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. Don't forget to subscribe, and that way you won't miss any of our weekly shows. But Black Spy Podcast is more than just looking at those centralized areas of the secret world. It also puts it into the context of the geopolitics that basically we in the secret world inhabit. And what is more important, or what is more spoken about today than the situation in Afghanistan? So in this episode, what we're going to do is look at Afghanistan, take some questions from subscribers, and then I'm going to try, and I can only say try, and put it all in context, answer those questions by putting everything in context. What I should say is, and what I should start off with, is that I've been working in and around Afghanistan for 30 years. More if you add to the fact that I've obviously been retired for several years. I first started working on Afghanistan in Scotland Yard's Special Branch, where we already began to see the result of Afghan veterans in the UK, and frankly, even before that, when under the Cold War system, we were aiding various Mujahideen types in the UK, and the backwash, when I say we, I'm talking about our services, were doing that. So for that read, that the service that I would later be part of, which is Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, was assisting in that process, assisting the CIA, obviously. That's something that's known, so I'm not giving anything away in terms of that. And then, obviously, in Special Branch, we were looking at what effect this would have on the United Kingdom in terms of the sympathies of Mujahideen and Afghan veterans. So, yes, I've worked on the issue for a long time. Later, as a case officer in Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, I was working against those who would cause terrorism in the West and against our allies in other parts of the world. And by then, what had happened is the Mujahideen had taken on the view that, frankly, it was probably always going to take on, and that was the battle for Islam as they perceived it, and I will say fundamentalist Islam, against the West as they perceived it, Christianity in a form of a virulent Christianity as they would see it, that was attacking Islam and Islamic nations. You have to understand the full story of Afghanistan before you come to those particular issues. Now, as for the Taliban, which we're now talking about, its actions were frankly limited to Afghanistan, to ruling Afghanistan, and the backwash that had within Pakistan, particularly the tribal areas of Pakistan. So, frankly, it wasn't affecting us other than the fact that because previously the West had supported the battle against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and I'm going to look at that in quite a bit of detail, the people who had gone over there from Saudi Arabia, from other parts of the Middle East, frankly, from Western countries, to assist in what was then provided by the West as a noble struggle after the Soviet intervention. Notice I'm not using the word invasion in the first instance, because it is well known and it is not disputed that the leader of the then Afghan communists who were running Afghanistan basically went to the Soviet Union and asked for assistance when there was an insurgency that he couldn't control. Frankly, in the first instance, the Soviet Union were not keen to get involved and actually said to Kamil, the leader, we will assist you in other ways, but we're not going to put our troops in there to aid you to fight what was by then a battle of, or portrayed as a battle of Islam against communism, people who were vowed atheists. You'll note the way I put that, because already, obviously, actions were happening in the Cold War context, because Afghanistan sat in the middle between two original Western allies, Iran and Pakistan. And then, of course, in the northern region, it absolutely butted with the Soviet Union. So post the Second World War, one could argue, from that time onwards, indeed you could even argue before, Afghanistan, even under the king, had relatively good relations with the Soviet Union and was slightly under the Soviet sphere of influence. So in the throes of the Cold War, it was relatively fair game for the East and West to battle there. So what actually tended to happen was in the 40s, late 40s, just after the Second World War, 50s, into the 60s, you had the Americans supporting southern areas with what it could do to aid and assist and to make the southern areas attractive to people who would not wish for communism. And the Soviets providing assistance to the northern areas and making it look attractive to those who wished for communism. And in fact, at one stage, Afghanistan was the third largest donor of funds from the Soviet Union. What then happened in Kabul University at the time is you had a very strong communist faction, socialist communist faction, that went towards the sphere of the Soviet Union, and a lesser faction, but nevertheless strong, of what was known as a third way, the Islamic way, not communist, not capitalist, but the Islamic way. And that was a battleground. And what would happen in the end is that the US, in particular, and then its allies, that includes the United Kingdom, would begin to support that sort of Islamic element. So that's sort of the rough outlay of Afghanistan before we get to the invasion. I'll use invasion on this in terms of the Soviet Union. The reason why I use the word invasion is because the former head who went to the Soviet Union, then, as I said, as somebody wishing for Soviet assistance, that individual was basically assassinated by his number two. And when the number two took power, you had the age-old problem with revolutions. And that age-old problem is, and it doesn't matter whether the revolution's from the left or from the right, to be quite truthful, what you generally find is the new broom comes in and sweeps away those that it thinks are counter-revolutionaries. And this is what began to happen with absolute fervour in Afghanistan, and many citizens brought in who were against the state. Those individuals were imprisoned and many executed. And I think that what happened was that the Soviet Union saw this and saw this would be a stain on the Soviet Union. And you can also imagine that at the time Brezhnev had said, do not do this to the head of the Afghan state, and therefore felt affected in that way. So against the advice of most of his Politburo, actually, an invasion was planned and the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, something that they would regret, the same way we, the British, regretted it when we went into Afghanistan. And this is the gist of the problem. Empires, and the Soviet Union was an empire. It wasn't the Russian Empire, it was the Soviet Empire. We have a big problem in the United Kingdom of saying Russia in the Cold War era when we actually meant the Soviet Union. The empires cannot appear weak. And so I think that the reason why the Soviets went in was that they would appear weak elsewhere. Now, this is the same argument for the United States going into Vietnam. They were supporting the government. If the government fell, would they appear weak? This is the reason why, again, the United States went into Afghanistan after 9/11. If they did not do something, would they appear weak? This is the perennial problem of empires, of superpowers, if you will. We had it before under the British Empire when we were absolutely the superpower. The problem always being what part of the empire would succeed from the Union. Well, it wasn't the Union, but from the empire. What part of the empire would drag the other parts of the empire away from the empire? And politicians seem very incapable of actually understanding what are real threats and what are elements that can be lost, but you can still stand strong as the empire. I'm not arguing whether an empire is right or wrong. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying this is what the point is. And even if you don't have an empire as it is perceived that you own and you exploit areas for your own wealth that are specifically orientated to you, then empires exist because you utilize your power, like the United States does, as an hegemony to bring forward its advantage. So let's be more specific with me. I was in the Secret Intelligence Service when 9/11 took place. I saw firsthand the perspective of the United States CIA colleagues who then straight away said, we must go into Afghanistan. The US military had a relatively same perspective a little bit, potentially not as gung-ho, but the politicians were absolutely so. The problem was, well, twofold. One is that intelligence services work to the politicians. So the politicians say, this is what we wish to achieve in policy today, not necessarily next month, next year, or in 10 years' time, but this is our policy now. This is what is affecting us right now. Because politicians, particularly in the West, and I'm saying particularly in the West because you have terms that your administration is in power, they need to look good at that particular time. So the longevity span isn't necessarily there. That means that when 9/11 happened, President Bush had options. My option for the UK, obviously had nothing to do with the United States, was why don't we assist the United States in carrying out what I call police actions to basically find bin Laden, who was sat in Afghanistan, and then to basically bring him to justice in whatever way is available. So that could be special forces actions and kill or capture. What I call the police action is to look and see who the culprit is, see where the culprit lays, work how to get that culprit, arrest, or kill or capture. That's the process. That does not involve invading the country. That does not involve killing a whole host of people who are innocent, who have had nothing to do with the actions that have taken place. Frankly, in Afghanistan, it didn't even have the action of overthrowing the Taliban, albeit that I would have never wanted the Taliban in power in the first place. But that was an action carried out in the past to defeat the Soviets by the CIA, and that action meant that they were in power. So what are you going to do about it? I had the task from our chief, which all those who watch the Bond movies know you call C, to basically try and prevent the war from happening in the first place in Afghanistan. I think I've said before I was unsuccessful, and so the war did happen. But I may have also explained in a previous episode that the war happened because that's what bin Laden knew would happen. He knew that the attack against the United States that he put in place was actually a pinprick. It cost the life of 3,000 people. It's a lot of people, don't get me wrong. But he knew that could not undermine, destabilise, throw down the United States in any way, shape or means. But he knew as a superpower, the United States could not allow that to happen without taking action that people could see. And the problem with my police action is you don't see it. It's something that's stealthy. It's something that special forces do. It's something that intelligence services do. And the only time you would have really seen it was when bin Laden was actually captured and then put on trial. But before that happened, it would not have been seen. So politicians don't like that necessarily, because the people may be asking, what are you doing about these people who've killed our citizens? So warfare was probably the only way for the politician. And bin Laden knew this. Why was he keen for that to happen? Because then the wavering Islamic believers, what I mean by wavering, if you think of Christianity, we use this term lapsed Catholics, and it basically means Catholic people who say they're Catholics, but frankly are just Catholic in name. And that can go for any denomination of Christianity. And this is the same with Islam and any denomination of Islam. The vast majority of people, yes, they'll do the prayer, but they're not going to go to a fundamentalist version of Islam, or per the book, if you will, that was written 13 centuries before, and live like 13 centuries before. They're not going to do that. They live in the modern world. So you have to make them have to wish to go to that process. And the way you do that, particularly for those who live in the West, is by showing that the West is anti-them. And how do you do that? By causing atrocities that make Westerners say, we don't want these Islamic people in our lands. And better still, let's attack these Islamic countries. That, my friends, is what bin Laden achieved. He made the West enemies. and it was achieved by the United States doing the work for him. So what I did today, I wanted to ask listeners to put in a few questions, and I'm going to answer a few at a sort of round-robin basis. What I should say before I actually take the first question is, to be truthful, nothing is simplistic. So I give you the simplistic view of what it is in geopolitics, but actually two of the main players of this whole process, yes, the CIA were assisting Mujahideen to kick out the Soviets. Yes, they wanted to bleed the Soviets out. And you can read this again. I'm not telling you anything secret in that sense, but you can read it. Yes, they wanted to bleed the Soviets out because the Soviets had bled out 55,000 Americans in Vietnam by aiding the Vietnamese in that process. And they'd also, at the time, were also carrying out actions in Angola, in South Africa, in much of the African continent, and frankly also were still, for the Americans, in America's backyard, in South America, in Central America. This is as the Americans see it. These could have been in, let's say, in El Salvador, wars of nationalism. But for the US, they were seen as communist wars against the United States, the domino theory. Let El Salvador fall, the rest of Central America falls, and before you know it, they'll be knocking on our door. This is how empires think. This is how the Soviet Union was thinking with Afghanistan, and this is how the United States was thinking in this Cold War. And this cost the lives of millions, literally millions, tens of millions of individuals around the world fighting the proxy Cold War. We call it a Cold War because it never got hot in Europe, but it was hot everywhere else. Now, one of these fervent anti-communists was a female by the name of Joanna Heron. Now, that name will mean nothing to you, and why should it? Other than the fact she was a multimillionaire and she hated communism with a vengeance and basically did everything she could to combat communists. And she went to Afghanistan, looked at it. The CIA are already doing actions therein, I think to the tune of X amount of millions, supporting the Afghans, the Pashtuns, and also Northern Alliance to kick out the Soviets, because what the Afghans hate more than anybody else are invaders as they perceive it. And of course, the Soviet Union began to be extremely brutal when its people started to be lost. And they were lost how? Its soldiers were being lost by IEDs, by ambushes, the same way as our soldiers began to be lost later on. When the United States invaded, we assisted in that invasion, the United Kingdom, and then NATO came in to assist. So the same thing happened. Basically, in the beginning, what the Soviet Union should have done is the police action that I was talking about later on, if it wanted to keep it communist, but it didn't. So this lady said we should provide assistance. Now, the way things are in this world is sometimes very strange. She was going out with a chap by the name of Charlie Wilson. And I know this sounds like it's crazy, and there is a Hollywood movie about it, and actually that movie is roundabout true. Obviously, you've got to accept that there's Hollywood elements to it, but it is roundabout true. This guy was a major player in the Senate on the intelligence committees. So he was able to swing monies to the CIA. And from millions going in from the CIA to assist this battle, this Charlie Wilson, because his girlfriend, Joanna, was saying we must do something, was able to put billions of dollars and provide Stinger missiles, provide the latest technology to destroy the Soviet and bleed the Soviets out. When I say things are simple, they never are. And add to that the fact that Saudi Arabia also wished to support getting the Soviets out for religious reasons and religious fervour, which is why bin Laden ends up there. So it was providing monies to the same tune as the United States. And then you had the Pakistanis, who for their own interests wished to support what would later be the Mujahideen and later become the Taliban, for its interests to destabilise India and make sure it could not be attacked from the Indians, and had, if you will, a buffer of Afghanistan against its arch enemy India. So this is how these simple actions they perceived to be at the beginning, if you will, multinational actions. So the CIA worked through the ISI, which is the Inter-Services Intelligence of the Pakistanis, and they provide weapons and assistance. They don't want it to look as though it comes from the United States or though it comes from Britain, and it comes through the Pakistanis and it goes to the Taliban, and they get trained and they get looked after and they get supported. And really, the main player in all of this is a Texan heiress. It's true. Believe it. Let me take the first question.
Hi, Carlton. It's Julia here from Yorkshire. I'm not very knowledgeable about the background in Afghanistan, beyond that the UK and the US wanted to remove Russia previously, hence our involvement since the 1990s. So my question really is, when did the Taliban become so prominent, and why is their form of Islam so oppressive to women, which does seem contrary to what I understand to be overall Islamic principles? Look forward to hearing what the answer might be.
So, Julia, great question. And I'll take the Islam thing first. What I would say is, you're absolutely right. Islam, in many ways, in the 7th century, was progressive to women. And even subsequently, it was progressive to women. And even if you look as far as, let's say, into the 20th century, you could argue that whilst in the West there weren't women who were leaders, you could say that Bangladesh, which is an Islamic state quasi, had a leader who was a woman. So what you're looking at, and I spoke about Christianity earlier on, it's basically how the interpretation is put forward in a cultural manner. And I'll say that again, in a cultural manner. So what that means is that religions don't stand alone. So as a good example, let's take Ethiopia, which has been Christian since before the West was. Its way of Christianity is completely different in many ways to the West's way of Christianity because of the cultural elements of Ethiopia. And this is exactly the same, if you will, when you look at how Christianity is practiced, let's say, by most Irish as opposed to English people, because England took on a version of Christianity. We all know the story of Henry VIII that suited Henry VIII, but Ireland kept with Catholicism. So Anglicanism functioned differently. Then that Anglicanism spread out from the greatest empire that the world has ever seen, the British Empire, read for that the English Empire at one stage, basically spread its version of Anglicanism, that's why I'm saying English, around the world. So then that becomes a force to be dealt with. And culturally, every country that took on this Anglicanism took it on within the structures of its cultural perspective. Hence, when the Taliban look at Islam, and I think that's what you're talking about, the Taliban in particular, and seek to get guidance as to how Islam should function from the book, specifically from the Quran as they see it, they actually orientate that as it's written at the time in the 7th century, as they perceive it. And the reason why I say that is the moment you translate anything, you have a change in emphasis and understanding. Plus also languages grow and move and work in different veins and ways. So example, if you take the Moors, we now talk about the Moors and we embellish it and give it a different version. Moor in most languages means black. But now we say, does it really? Were they not lighter-skinned people who were the Moors? Now, if you look back in history, they used to say tawny Moor for lighter-skinned. And in England, we called it blackamoor because in the English language, Moor did not mean black. So imagine Christianity and how we change it from our understanding of what Amharic was, which is the language in which it was written, is exactly the same with Arabic. So if you look at the language of Arabic in which the Quran is written, and you then see how people who are not Arabic speakers translate it, albeit that they're saying the verse in Arabic, they've got to have an understanding about what the translation means. So they may translate things as to their understanding. So if it said, example, women should be veiled, it may have meant, I don't know, and I will always say, I'm not an expert, I'll say I'm not an expert, but it may have meant back in the 7th century that they should be veiled at particular circumstances, at particular times, in line with the custom of the Yemen at the time. But if you look at the custom of the Pashtun in particular, in Afghanistan, the veiling may have been at all times. So they just took that line and said women should be veiled at all times. And that's exactly the same when you look at other elements of the custom. So it might not even mention necessarily very strongly what women should do. But when you have a void, what you tend to do is work within the system which you have. So therefore, I would say that there's more cultural elements within the Islam as practiced by the Taliban than there are solely religious elements. I hope in conjunction with what I said prior to taking your question, Julia, that explains why the Taliban treat women in a very negative manner. Now, what you should understand, under the Soviet system, and before that, when the Afghans were close to the Soviets, women in the 60s and 70s, until the Soviets left, obviously, in the early 80s, women, especially in the cities, were basically involved in every aspect of Afghan life. We supporting the Mujahideen turned back that. Women were wearing miniskirts, Afghan women I'm talking about, in Kabul back in the 60s and 70s. We turned that back by supporting a body that, frankly, wanted to overthrow the Soviets, so hence were good bedfellows for us. When I say for us, for the United States and the West. The price to be paid for that was how women were going to be treated in the future. But as I said to you before, that's not the job of intelligence agencies. The job of intelligence agencies is to do the bidding of the politicians. And they say, get out the Soviets. So what's the best way to do that? They then direct the military to do that. What's the best way to do that? It should have been for the politicians then to say, now we're going to put pressure on those that have thrown out the Soviets for women to have good treatment and to work in a certain manner. They didn't do that for the pure and simple reason that once the Soviets were thrown out and the Cold War ended around about the same time, frankly, who give a damn in Washington what happened in Afghanistan? Next question. And again, I put the preface back on, the strong preface that what I do say is, if I'm not an expert on a particular issue, I will always say, because I think it's extremely important to understand that.
Yeah, hi Carlton. It's all here, all through of Nobody Special. During my research into Nobody Special, I came into contact with a lot of military contractors, and we're still in contact. And we chat about various things, and obviously Afghanistan is high on the agenda at the moment. My question is, what's your take on the surplus that's been left over there? The vehicles, the arms, the ammunition, and the aircraft, because the Taliban now effectively have an air force. And that air force, I believe, has the Allies' IFF codes. Do you think that poses a problem for neighbouring countries or for any of the allied countries? I look forward to your take on the matter.
Thanks, Dids. What I would say is the following. I basically touched on most of the points that you're making in my preamble to the questions, to Julia's question and now to yours. But to answer yours more specifically, those same police actions that I spoke about previously, that we should have been carrying out in the beginning, let me suggest to you that what will happen is that certain police actions will be going on now, but not in the form of trying to capture individuals, but in the form of making sure the most dangerous kit doesn't get utilised in a manner that would be negative to the West. Specifically regarding the IFF codes, what I'd say is this, not my area of expertise. However, my knowledge is such that any code can be changed. So I would suggest that will be an element. But more importantly, frankly, the Taliban don't have the capacity to basically fly complex aircraft en masse. I'm not going to say that there aren't those who were previously in other armies and have gone to Afghanistan as Mujahideen and will now go to Afghanistan as Mujahideen and don't have the capability to fly. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying as a unified, complex, controlled air force, it really takes a lot of capacity to get an air force up and running, to repair, control, command and control, to do all of the elements that are required in just arming aircraft that, frankly, I don't think they'll have. I think they got bigger fish to fry. Now, if you're talking about kit on the ground, as I said, normal everyday kit, articulated weapons, guns, whatever, yeah, they will have that capacity to utilise that. But as I said, the most dangerous kit, I've no doubt, will be dealt with via the people who should have dealt with bin Laden in the first instance, rather than us actually going into a war there. The other part of your question that seemed to signify allies and so on and so forth, frankly, I don't see the Taliban in any way, shape or means attempting to push out beyond their borders, other than, and I'll say that again, other than elements of the Haqqani network pushing into maybe Pakistan. And so Pakistan's assistance, which it wanted the buffer zone, may actually, and it has been for many years, be turned back on them through actions particularly in the tribal areas, Quetta and beyond. So what I'm saying is that for the West, as you're perceiving it, I don't see a problem. The biggest problem, obviously, if it would, again, become to be used as the base, a la Al-Qaeda, in which it could push out into other areas in terms of terrorist actions, terrorist training centres, so on and so forth. And I think, as I said before, that those police actions will incorporate all of that type of countering of terrorism that will still go on in Afghanistan as and when it is so required. But the other side to that coin is, I'm thinking, while I'm speaking to you, I don't see the advantage for Afghanistan, for the Taliban, if they want to run the country for any period of time, of actually causing terrorist actions into the West. Because I could see something happening by bodies that it might bring in just because they were aiding and assisting, and because it's such a rugged and treacherous country, that I could see near neighbours having a problem, e.g. China, Russia. And frankly, that's why China and Russia never had any interest in the West being defeated as it was. I should say before I end, because I like to keep my show around the 35, 45 minutes, as you know, Dids, I should say that terrorism is a motherhood subject. So I could perceive that all of these countries who have a potential threat against them, including China and Russia, would work together on occasions to defeat actions that might come out of Afghanistan. With the United States, I'm talking about, and the UK and various other countries that have capacity, because we still do have good capacity in SIS, in MI6. So what I'm saying is, I could see that for interests of those countries that are close and the countries that may have a problem, that everybody will be working together in a kind of a way, not collegially all holding hands doing the same thing as the West does amongst itself and NATO, but others coming on board, working from their own perspective to defeat possible future terrorism. And of course, the fact that the US has the monies basically sitting in its bank accounts of most of Afghan Taliban, that's going to be a big hindrance. Now, what I should say is, before we go on this special, is that all those people, particularly Tugendhat in Britain and various others who are talking about Britain should do this and Britain should do that, we have to be realistic in the United Kingdom. We have to understand what our power is and where we actually have capacity to do something on our own. And frankly, we don't have the capacity to do on our own to fight a war in Afghanistan. It just isn't there. The days of empire are gone. And our biggest problem, and this also comes back to Brexit, our biggest problem is we haven't told our citizens this. We are not tier one country. Now, it's not negative being a tier two country. We are not like the United States. We are not like China, for God's sake. We do not have that capacity. Yeah? And it's not in our advantage. And indeed, Afghanistan was no longer in the advantage of the United States. You just look at the fact, very quickly now, had Biden have left soldiers in Afghanistan, I'm going to leave you with this. Think about it, because what the show should be doing is educating. Had Biden have left US soldiers in Afghanistan to fight for another 10 years, every soldier that died after Trump's actions that actually got him a way out, and he knew that there was a small window for that way out because he knew the war would restart. But after he got the way out, dealing not with the Afghan government anymore, but directly with the Taliban, by the way, at the talks in Doha. After he found a way out, Trump, where he could leave and quasi say, we've left honourably, after he did that, had Biden have kept the troops in, every soldier who dies would be down to Biden's administration. And politicians don't think like that. They do not want a noose hanging around their neck when it comes to the next election, whereby they can say, my son, my daughter died in Afghanistan because you left Trump's troops there and Trump had got us out. So think about it. Thank you very much. I leave you with that, guys, and hopefully you'll tune in again next week for another episode of Black Spy Podcast. Please subscribe, press the bell, give me a whatever star review that you think the programme's worth. I hope it's 5. See you again next week.
Carlton King is a real-life working-class spy, bringing you the details, the stories, and secrets from his life spent spying. Give us a 5-star rating on Apple iTunes, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss any of the excitement. This is for your ears only.
My name's Carlton King, and I'm an ex-spy.
This podcast was produced by a podcast company. If you need help with your podcast, simply visit apodcastcompany.com or email Jason at apodcastcompany.com.